Fred Swanson is a new resident of Grover, of this area of Wayne County, relatively new. I've known him for many years as an author. He's the author of at least 5 books, and several of them with the University of Utah Press. He does have books here tonight that he'll sign after the presentation. And so it's an honor to welcome Fred Swanson tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Jed. Thanks very much. What a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thanks for coming. I understand this may be the last presentation we're having in this hall. Well, that's an honor. Wow. Yeah. So thank you to the board members and the volunteers of Entrada for, again, putting on a wonderful year of programs. And I'd especially like to just give my praise to John Lee and Alan Dewey for all they do behind the controls, as it were, to keep things running smoothly here. It couldn't happen without them. Yeah. Well, many of you were here last night for Craig Child's presentation. Wasn't that great? Just so important to value and protect our night skies here. Tonight we're going to be going back to an era when the night skies were dark. More than 100 years ago, a gentleman from back east came out to Wayne County and surrounding counties to undertake a journey of some 500 miles across the high plateaus of Utah. And he did this with several things in mind. He wanted to piece together the lay of the land, the geography and the geology. It was a learning trip for him. As it turned out, it also cemented the bond of a deep friendship that would last between the two families for many years. I should welcome those of you on Facebook, too, who are tuning in tonight, some good friends, and I believe a couple members of the David Rust's family, of his relations. Also, just a thanks to Jed for that introduction. Jed Rogers is the senior editor at the University of Utah Press, which has published 4 of my books, and they have been just great to work with over the years, very professional and supportive. The book I'll be drawing from tonight is actually an earlier work from the University of Arizona Press, Journeys in the Canyonlands of Utah and Arizona, 1914 to 1916. And I first spoke about this book here at Entrada 20 years ago. It was the first time I came to Entrada. I don't know if any of you were there back then. But now here I get to be among friends and neighbors. What could be better? Yeah. George Corning Fraser is the subject and the author of tonight's presentation. He was an attorney who lived in Morristown, New Jersey. He had a successful law practice on Wall Street. He belonged to some of New York City's elite clubs. And yet, every summer, he traveled for a number of years. He traveled out to the desert Southwest to go exploring. His colleagues at his law practice found that a little strange. They took their vacations at the shore. But as we'll see, Mr. Fraser had a very different thing in mind for his vacations. Fraser was interested in geology. He had studied the subject at Princeton, his undergraduate alma mater, and he had read the great studies, the monographs produced by the scientists involved with the Powell survey in the 1870s and 1880s, such as Clarence Dutton here, who wrote these geological monographs that were the first to explain the relationships of the strata, the whole topography of what John Wesley Powell called the Plateau Province. George Fraser acquired copies of these works, read through them, annotated them, and in the early 1900s, he came up with the idea that he ought to go out west and see the same country that these scientists had explored. And so he conceived of doing a number of different trips in which he could piece together the whole of the Colorado Plateau landscape in his mind. Now, he knew that he needed a guide for this purpose, and so he wrote to a Union Pacific Railway official in Salt Lake City and asked, who would there be that could guide me and my son through this country? And that person replied that there really was only one person, and that was Dave Roost of Kanab, Utah, whom I've spoken of before here at Entrada. And Roost was an educator by profession. He and his family lived in Kanab, where he served as the superintendent of schools. But during the summers, he liked to saddle up his pack stock and head out into the wilderness of the Colorado Plateau. And he made a small living as an outfitter and guide to all kinds of people who wanted to really get back into the far recesses of this region. So Fraser and Roost connected and arranged to do the first of a series of 3 trips that Fraser had planned from 1914 through 1916. The first of these was a visit to the Grand Canyon. They actually started in Zion Canyon, rode out through the Arizona Strip Desert up onto the Kanab Plateau to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, where we see Mr. Fraser standing at the rim, very unafraid, with his son, George Jr., down there. And they proceeded along the rim and stopped at a number of the viewpoints there to get a good picture of what the Grand Canyon looked like. I'm going to skip over the 1915 trip, which is the focus of the talk tonight. Their third expedition in 1916 took in the northern Navajo Reservation, including a visit to Rainbow Bridge. They actually started in Flagstaff, rode across the Grand Canyon on a trail that Dave Roost had helped develop, followed out through the eastern Kanab Plateau, through the Navajo Res. And this country was so remote that toward the end of their trip, when they stumbled across Monument Valley, they didn't even know what it was. And that just gives you an idea of how remote this region was in that time. And these were arduous trips. These were on horseback with a few pack stock, no automobile support. There weren't even any roads out there then. Here we see the party on their 1916 trip approaching Lee's Ferry, and you could just kind of make out the road that they were, back up. The road that they were following here, going off in the distance toward the Echo Cliffs. 100-degree heat, biting flies, bad water when you could find water. It wasn't the sort of place your average tourist came to, and yet for Mr. Fraser, this is what he knew he needed to do to begin to really understand what this region was about. So going back 1 year to 1915, we find the Frasers, again senior and junior, undertaking their second journey, taken in the high plateaus of Utah, starting in Salina, moving down through the Fish Lake Plateau, over the Thousand Lake, kind of a little detour out to the Henry Mountains, back through the Water Pocket Fold, across the Aquarius Plateau, to the Table Cliffs, on to Panguitch, the Markagant Plateau, skirting the headwaters of Zion, and finally ending out here in the West Desert. A journey of 6 weeks and 500, no, I have that backwards. 5 weeks and 600 miles on horseback. The high plateaus are interesting country, geologically unique, I feel. Wallace Stegner, writing many years ago, described them as not mountains at all, but rather a series of greatly elevated rolling plains. And this is a look off across from Thousand Lake Mountain, a photograph I took recently, toward the Fish Lake High Top. A word here about Mr. Fraser's journals, which form the heart of this book. I've excerpted from his voluminous journals that he kept of these trips. He was a prolific and detailed note taker. He noted such things as the hour that they woke up every morning, the temperature of the streams that they tried to bathe in, all sorts of minutiae. A lot of notes about geology, which weren't all that interesting, but what really captivated me about his journals was his interest in the people who lived here. He was interested in their economic conditions, what they did for a living, what it was like to try to just live in this remote part of the Mormon frontier in the early 1900s. And that, to me, was the real heart of his journals, this encounter between an Easterner of an educated and affluent background with people who were trying to scratch out a living on this frontier. Most of the photographs that I'll be showing you were taken either by Mr. Fraser or Mr. Roost. They're not of professional quality. Conditions were very difficult out in the field. And here we see George Fraser changing film packs in a dark bag out on the Navajo reservation, in 90-degree heat. So there were some real challenges for the photography in those days. Dave Roost met George Fraser in Salina. His pack outfit consisted of 3 saddle horses, 2 pack horses, and a mule. This is actually a later photograph showing a few different animals. But Roost was an experienced packer. He had grown up in this region. His parents were pioneers who had homesteaded in Grass Valley out by Burrville. That sign up there refers to a Rust Spring, and that was George Roost, Dave's father. The family moved to Caneville later on. They were among the first settlers in what was then called the Dirty Devil River Valley. And that's where Dave grew up and learned to make his way out in the backcountry with the family sheep herds. So, June 24th, 1915, the Frasers, senior and junior, are ready to leave Morristown Station for the 5-day rail journey out west. They stopped to in Colorado to take the Cog Railway up Pikes Peak. They visited the Garden of the Gods, and then they boarded the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway for the journey through Utah to Salina, where they met up with Dave Roost. And here they set out from Salina at 8 in the evening, going up Salina Canyon. It was hot. They found a place to lay out their bedrolls in a rancher's pasture. Fraser wrote in his journals that there were a few mosquitoes and more gnats than I have ever encountered before. It was very hot. The night was uncomfortable. But the next day, they made their way up to the high country of the Fish Lake Plateau, following up Gooseberry Creek, beautiful drainage, past a few towns that no longer exist. Nyash there was a route on a planned railway that never came to be. Here's Fraser's notes from that day. We turned southeast up the grass-covered bottom of Gooseberry Valley, through a fence and past several small ranches, at one of which, quite deserted, we stopped for lunch. It was exceedingly hot riding up Salina Canyon, but here, under a cottonwood tree, in tall grass, we had protection from the sun and enjoyed a cool breeze from the northwest up the valley. We were lucky to find a good spring. On undoing the pack, Roost laid out a rectangular, thin parcel, about 2 feet by 18 inches. I had noticed this when we packed up, but as he volunteered nothing about its contents, I suppressed my curiosity. It was a surprise and a gratification to find that it contained a cake, baked by his venerable mother of the highest degree of excellence. So those are the hardships of the trail, I guess. You have bugs one day and dessert the next. So they continued on up, aiming for the high country of the northern part of the Fish Lake Plateau. They first climbed Mount Terrell If anyone knows how that's pronounced, is it Terrell? Terrell? It's one of the high points on the Fish Lake, 11,500 feet high. Fraser complained of a headache. He attributed that to eating greasy food, but I strongly suspect it was from their rapid ascent to altitude. But the reward was a great view from the top, and as you'll see, they were just going from high point to high point all the way through the plateau country, looking for these vantages where he could begin to piece together the landscape. He likened it to having a relief map laid out with all of the different relations of the topography. From Terrell, they went on to Mount Marvine, which was a somewhat more difficult climb, steep and rocky. Fraser described it as a difficult ascent. He actually had experience with roped climbing from his boyhood when he and his father traveled in the Alps, and I assume they hired guides and climbed some of the peaks there. So he led the way up Mount Marvine on what looks to me like a good fourth-class pitch. Again, the reward was the views out over the high points of the Fish Lake Plateau. They could see well off to the east into the desert of the San Rafael Swell country. From there, they dropped down and back up again to the Fish Lake high top, camping again at 11,000 feet. They made it to the summit there, and there was, as you notice here in late June, there's still snow on the high peaks. And then they dropped down to Fish Lake, passed by the lake, and made their way down to the village of Fremont. Excuse me. Crossing the Awapa Plateau. Fraser had a choice comment as they were going across the Awapa. They came across a fence with a Forest Service sign on it that as he put it, exhorted the traveler to maintain the beauty of this forest. And he looked around and couldn't see any trees, and he thought surely they must be joking, but it actually was national forest land. So in dropping down to Fremont, they stopped in at the ranch home of a friend of Dave Rust's. I remember the Bryan family was all that Fraser mentioned, but obviously a family from that era. And I've not been able to find out which of the Bryans that might have been. But as it turned out, the Bryans were running a creamery there near the Fremont River. And Mrs. Bryan had been a pupil of Dave Rust's when he taught school in Loa. Here's George Fraser's account of that afternoon. We camped under the portico of the creamery beside a fine, clear, cool brook, taking its rise at a spring in the hillside a few rods above us. Rust's father at one time had been bishop at Loa, and Rust had taught school in Loa. It turned out that Mrs. Bryan was one of Rust's pupils. Mr. Bryan, his small boy, and a friend of the boys stood by while we ate lunch. The boys had their pockets full of angleworms, and each carried a large branch with a string attached and an immense fish hook. They retired for about 15 minutes and returned with 3 trout, which they presented to us. I suggested their hooks were rather large and offered them some small hooks. They insisted on paying for these hooks, and it was with great difficulty that I got them to understand that they cost nothing. Then they retired with the new hooks, and in 10 minutes returned with more trout. George and I spent a couple of hours fishing the stream. We saw plenty of trout, usually hiding under the grass banks. George got 1 fish, a little one. My bait was eaten several times, but I never got a good strike. We had a nice mess of fish for supper. And this to me was just typical of the rather dry humor that Fraser shows throughout his journals here. So the next morning, reprovisioned with fresh bread and eggs from the Bryans, they headed up over Thousand Lake Mountain and then dropped down to the desert at the head of what's known as the North Desert and South Desert, country which many of you may know, here at the what's now known as the South Desert Overlook and the temples of Cathedral Valley. But this was not Cathedral Valley back in these days. The Park Service didn't know about this country. This was an area Dave Rust had herded sheep in his youth, and this is why he took the Frasers there to see these huge Entrada sandstone monoliths. Fraser's notes from their visit there, I think, are rather captivating. He was fascinated with the colors of the hills and the monuments as the day went on. Rust had been familiar with this country when a boy and up to about 25 years ago, but since that time had not been here. Nevertheless, he remembered where water was to be had. While he and George took the water keg and water bags about a quarter mile northerly from the camp, I sat on the brink of the cliff bounding the South Desert and studied the Henry Mountains and the Water Pocket Fold, the latter forming the southerly boundary of the South Desert. After getting water, we walked to the head of the Middle Desert. The coloring and sculpture here is beyond anything we have seen. The cliffs rise precipitously from the flat, barren desert floor, perhaps 250, 350 feet. These are wholly of Carmen rock, the white bed of the summit having been eroded off. The desert is sandy, cream to yellow, with a few pinyons and cedars showing patches of green. On the summit of the cliffs, accentuated and silhouetted, as it were, basalt boulders lie on the pure white sandstone. The sun set clear, save for some fleecy clouds to the north. Sitting on the brink of the cliff, the Henry Mountains rose against the sky, appearing in the light of the setting sun, first blue, then grayish in the haze of the cloudless sky, and as the sun went below the horizon and still touched them, they appeared burnished with gold, and which gradually, as the light waned, turned to lilac until their illumination ceased. The prevailing tone of the foreground was magenta, with white and terracotta streaks due to the wash from above. In the desert were patches of pinyons and cedars. The silence was complete, save for an occasional bird call and the buzzing of gnats and mosquitoes. The silence was complete. Something to keep in mind. I just find his descriptions interesting. To me, George Fraser belongs to an earlier era, kind of the Victorian era of travelers who undertook these trips with the idea of recording what they see, with kind of an intellectual approach to it all. George Fraser's photographs of the towers in what we now know as Cathedral Valley, to my mind, may be the first that were taken there since the Fremont expedition passed through in 1853. You may be aware of the photographer that accompanied that expedition, Solomon Carvalho, who took daguerreotypes, an early form of photographs of some of these monoliths, which unfortunately were later lost in a fire, but some engravings that were made from those prints showed up only 30 years ago, and an author was able to piece together the location of them. So from Cathedral Valley, which did not become part of Capitol Reef until much later, the party headed south toward Caneville, riding across the deserts that Dave Rust had known as a youth. Fraser noted that this was the landscape in which Rust learned to fix directions and learn how to find water and travel through all of this. So they reached the Dirty Devil River, as it was known then, the Fremont, near Caneville. They wanted to get a bath, so they waded out into the river, found that it was about 4 inches deep, lay down in it and tried to splash water over themselves. The mosquitoes landed on them in clouds. So they gave up on that and went on into Caneville, which at that time, as Fraser noted, consisted of a dozen or so tumble-down shacks stretched along 1.5 miles of the river. Many of the original settlers had left because of a series of disastrous floods that hit Caneville and the whole Blue Valley in the early 1900s. But they looked up an old acquaintance of Rust's named John Curfew, who had been a mail carrier. He was elderly and kind of laid up by that time, but they stopped in to visit him. And Fraser noted that he was astonished to find Mr. Curfew engaged in reading the Literary Digest and very aware of and interested in current events. So they talked a while. But really that wasn't that surprising, because a lot of the people who lived out here were very eager for news from the outside world. And a traveler like George Fraser represented a connection, somebody that would tell them what's going on in the world. They understood how isolated they were here, and they longed for that connection to the outside world. So continuing on here, they've left Caneville. They go through the desert below the cliffs up to the Henry Mountains. This was kind of a detour from their high plateaus traverse, but Dave Rust knew that the viewpoint from the top of Mount Ellen was not to be missed. And so up they rode, again reaching 11,000 feet. This shows the north peak of Mount Ellen. And on the way, they encountered a rancher that Rust knew. I spoke with Dave's son, Quentin, years ago, and he mentioned that Dave Rust knew every rattlesnake in southern Utah. And he seemed to know all the people as well. So there's a sheep camp there run by a fellow named George Coleman from Teasdale. And you can see Mr. Coleman's tent there. There were a couple of other sheep herders lounging about. So they went on up to the summit and enjoyed the tremendous view, this very central location. They could see the cliffs of the San Rafael Swell. The view extended clear down to Monument Valley. And they came back down and chatted with some of these sheep herders. One of them was a fellow with red hair who was friendly and said that he was running sheep on the other side of the mountain, and perhaps you'd like to come down and spend the night with us. And so they did that. They descended the steep eastern slope of Mount Ellen and managed to find this fellow, these two boys' camp by firelight. In the morning, they looked around, and I should mention that while they were up there on the top of the mountain, this sheep herder was telling, as Fraser put it, distressing stories of how bad the feed was on his side of the mountain. So here's the excerpt. One back here. Okay. The sheep herders had pitched their tent near a small sheep corral and beside a running stream. We camped in the corral, but were not allowed to use any of our provisions. The boys had arranged to entertain us. They were Leland Busenbark, who lives at Nodam, Utah, and Buchanan, whose home is in Caneville, both of them about 18 years of age. Well, the Busenbark name will be familiar to a number of you here, I'm sure. Busenbark is a sheep herder, and Buchanan is cook and camp mover. They have been friends from boyhood. Busenbark's parents were separated when he was a small child, and at 10 years he went to work for his present employers, the Bounds brothers of Provo. He was paid $5 a month and his keep to start, but in 2 months was so good that he was raised to $15. Soon he got $35, and now is getting, and for a good while has gotten, $50 a month, food, tent, and boots. He has to supply himself with a horse and clothes, and he is not very particular about the latter. He is in charge of 3,000 sheep, and he takes his responsibilities heavily. He it was that we met near the north summit of the mountain. We were astonished to find that his sheep here enjoy the most beautiful pasture, with grass as tall as they are, plenty of water, and conditions generally ideal. We asked him how he reconciled this with his depressing remarks to the other herders. He explained that he did not want anybody coming over to see how well off he was, and that sheep herding required diplomacy as well as care. So this photograph's pretty blurry, but as near as I can make out, you have Dave Roost on the left. These two are probably the two boys, Busenbark and Buchanan, and George Jr. in there. The only photograph I have of them. Dick, one of these days I need to quiz you about more about the Busenbark family. So from the Henry Mountains, they dropped down to cross the Water Pocket Fold, again staying at another ranch, and climbing on up through Oak Creek Canyon to the edge of the Aquarius Plateau on Boulder Mountain. And here they stopped and met another friend of Dave Roost's, Walter E. Hanks, who with his wife Mary Ellen had they had a homestead up there, and he was now serving as the Forest Service ranger at Wildcat Pasture. That ranger station is still standing in the back of the pasture at Wildcat, way behind the visitor center there. Moving on. Excuse me for a moment. Okay, 6:30, arrived at Wildcat Ranger Station, where Roost was warmly welcomed by Ranger Hanks in charge. We camped a couple of 100 yards outside the fence enclosing the ranger station, beside a ditch carrying water from one of the streams that takes its rise from the melting snows of the mountain, under immense trees and on the best of grass. Walter E. Hanks lives at Grover, about 20 miles from here, where he has a farm. He is about 50 years of age and spends from May to October in each year at the ranger station. This year, Mrs. Hanks, 2 small children, and a hired girl are with him. The Hanks have a number of milk cows in the pasture. The boys drive these in, and the ladies make butter and cheese. For supper, Mrs. Hanks sent us fresh milk and butter, corn pone, raw onions, and bread. We talked with Hanks till 9:45 and then went to bed. And the next day, they rode up to the top of, to the rim of Boulder Mountain at Chokecherry Point, what was then called Tantalus Point. Fraser particularly wanted to see the survey station that had been used by the Thompson party, Almond Thompson, during the surveys in 1872. Here's his notes. We had an exceptionally, I should mention that this is Walter Hanks on the left, George Fraser, and Dave Roost on the stone monument erected by the Powell survey there. We had an exceptionally clear morning, which perhaps aided our vision, but I think we appreciated this view better because we knew more of the country, which we overlooked. For all the world, the lowland is like a relief map colored geologically. The most striking features of the landscape are the temples in and west of the Water Pocket Fold. Now, they found in a little tin can up there some notes left by Almond Thompson himself, and I really wish that those had been preserved. Maybe they exist somewhere, but I've not been able to locate them. Those of you who know Brian Swanson, he found some journal notes. He found a diary that had been left up there that had been copied and was in the forest headquarters at Cedar City. He made copies of those and put them up in a can up there at Chokecherry, and they make really interesting reading. But here's Fraser's report on the contents of that can. Walter Hanks is reserved and correct in his demeanor and speech, and very resentful of the profane and obscene literature which sheep herders seem prone to produce. On every trip, he expurgates the contents of the tin can. From the point, we looked down on the Hanks farm, and with the glass, Hanks was able to make out his boys working in the field, told us the names of his horses and on the hay wagon and various other details. Hanks's personality is extremely attractive. He impresses one as possessed of great force and being thoroughly honest. His father was a noted scout, and I think one of the pioneers. Well, yes, Ephraim Hanks was a pioneer. We arrived back at the ranger station at 11:45. When we had the fire lit, the Hanks children brought us 5 trout again, which they had got that morning, besides more milk and butter. On leaving, Mrs. Hanks invited us to return with our entire family and to spend the best part of any summer. I think she meant it. She gave Rust a large pot of wild elderberry jam made by herself, which we hugely enjoyed. Now just think for a minute about this kind of travel that they were experiencing, the hospitality of people they would meet along the way, the interactions, the conversations. It's a very different kind of travel than most of us experience now, with tourism being a little more, cut and dried and laid out for us. But that for me was one of the real attractions of this encounter, as I call it, between two cultures. From the wildcat pasture, they climbed up to the rim of the Aquarius, probably close to Bounds Point, and started a long traverse over the next 2 days across this huge tableland. It was difficult going. There was still snow up on the plateau. The meadows were boggy. There was a lot of blowdown. One of the horses was growing lame, and Fraser's impression of the Aquarius was not all that positive. In contrast to Clarence Dutton's descriptions in his report on the high plateaus, in which he described the Aquarius Plateau should be illustrated upon canvas and described in blank verse. So maybe Dutton wrote that when he was back home. This photograph here was actually a photograph taken in 1873 by the photographer for the Powell survey, Jack Hillers. So they proceed on across the Aquarius, down to the Table Cliff Plateau, clear out to its terminus at Powell Point, another one of the great survey sites used by the Powell survey in the 1870s. And it gave them a tremendous view out over the whole Paria River amphitheater. They could see all the way to the Kaibab. Fraser took photos there, but they didn't turn out because the glare of the sun on the white, if you've been there, this very light-colored rock there on Powell Point interrupted his photography. They did drop down below the cliffs below Powell Point, and here you see George Jr. Perched on a little pinnacle beneath a small arch, and there's a Forest Service trail now that goes very near to this point. They continued on. I'll get to this in a minute. They continued on to Panguitch, where they rested and reprovisioned and got their mail. Fraser's comments on this are kind of humorous. As they approached from the south to Panguitch, here we became conscious we were approaching a metropolis, for old Jake, the pack horse, whose existence heretofore had been peaceful, was nearly run over by a demonstration motor car containing the local doctor. Arrived Panguitch 12:30 after a 15-mile ride. We made straight for the post office where I expected to get letters, but met with disappointment. The town was filled with loafers, in an unusual number even for this country. Many of them were congregated about the post office. While I was making inquiries within, some of these remarked, apropos our outfit, that a Wild West show had come to town. Rust bluffed them out with an offer to sell reserved seats. So having taken the expedition through Wayne County, I'm going to kind of skip over a little bit of the remainder of their trip. But it did puzzle me why on this trip they did not see Bryce Canyon, shown here in a later Park Service photograph. And it simply was the case that Bryce was not well known in 1915. Very few people knew about the geologic wonders that lay down there. And so they bypassed it and instead went down Casto Canyon toward Panguitch. There would actually not be an article in the national in a national magazine about Bryce Canyon until 1918. And that's when a world traveler named Leroy Jeffers penned an article in the pages of Scientific American titled "The Temple of the Gods in Utah." And that was the first national press that Bryce got. Well, it turned out that the person who guided Leroy Jeffers to Bryce Canyon was Dave Rust, who in the intervening couple of years had learned more about what you could see down there. And on future trips, Rust always made sure to take his clients to Bryce Canyon. So from Table Cliff Plateau, again, as I said, they went to Panguitch, continued up onto the Markagant Plateau to Bryan Head, and they'll continue around the headwaters of Zion Canyon, then known as the Mukuntu Weep, here. They'll eventually drop down to Canaraville and then head on from there. They climbed Bryan Head at over 11,000 feet. It offered another fine view over the countryside, although Fraser noted that it really couldn't compare with the views from the Aquarius or from Table Cliff. They dropped down to Duck Lake. Fraser found the meadows of the Markagant were very pleasant, full of flowers and grass, and he thought it was the nicest country they'd gone through. They stayed with several sheep herders along the way, and from one of them, Fraser learned that 75,000 sheep were being pastured in the headwaters of the Virgin River at that time, most of them belonging to people in Cedar City. Fraser notes in his journals that there was a lot of erosion coming down the streams from heavily grazed rangelands, and this would continue to be a problem for some years with difficulties with flooding in some of the towns lower down, until the Forest Service instituted an allotment system to manage grazing in these mountains. Passing around the headwaters of Zion, they had to drop in and out of these precipitous canyons. It was pretty slow going, but it did give them views into some of these deep slots. Fraser labeled this as the headwaters of Orderville Canyon. From there, they dropped down through the Kolob canyons down into Wrong way to go. They dropped down to Canaraville, climbed the Pine Valley Mountain, which he found was a splendid view, and then continued on through the desert to Modena. He described it as a hot, dry, and dusty ride, where the Frasers boarded a train for Los Angeles and said their goodbyes to Dave Rust. They had been in the saddle for 5 weeks and seen a tremendous amount of country. This trip really cemented a friendship between George Fraser and Dave Rust, and in the ensuing years, Fraser came back again and again with different members of his family. In 1916, as I mentioned, he returned with his son George Jr. for that traverse of the Navajo country. In 1921, Mr. Fraser returned with his wife, Jane, shown here, for a horse and wagon trip to Bryce Canyon. So they finally got to see Bryce. Their daughter, Anne, came along with them on this trip. The following year, 1922, Fraser again met up with Rust, this time with his daughter, Jane, for a trek down to the Crossing of the Fathers in Glen Canyon. They actually started at Teasdale at the Pace Ranch, where Dave was keeping his pack stock, traversed the Aquarius Plateau, saw Bryce Canyon, dropped down into the Paria country, and way out into that very remote desert in Warm Springs Creek to the Crossing of the Fathers, where Dave Rust located the actual steps that had been chiseled into the rock by the members of the Dominguez Escalante Party in the winter of 1777-78. Fraser wrote an article about this trip for Natural History magazine. The last trip that George Fraser made to Utah was with his youngest daughter, Sarah Fraser, in 1930. Again, they met up with Dave Rust, who by then had established a little business guiding people down Glen Canyon. He had these little portable folding canoes that he used to take people down the canyon. I had the great privilege of speaking with Sarah Fraser about this trip. Dave Rust brought an assistant boatman along to help with the paddling. His name was Bert Loper. And Sarah told how it was riding in this little boat with Bert Loper at the oars, and what amazing stories he told of his years mining gold on the Colorado River. Wouldn't that have been an experience? How are we doing on time? Okay. One of the things I was curious about with these journals is there's very little mention of his son, George Jr., in them. Here he is shown on in Upper Zion Canyon on their 1914 trip. And I guess it just wasn't the practice back then to get very personal in your journals. At least it wasn't with him. But I had to wonder, what did the younger Fraser think of this? He must have enjoyed it. He must have found the challenges worthwhile, because he came back again and again. Unfortunately, he passed away long before I could interview him. So what do we make of a trip like this? It was a great adventure, certainly, but it was also a learning experience and was intended as such for Mr. Fraser. And for myself, as Bess Ann and our daughter well remember, when I started reading these journals, I became possessed with this idea that you could travel through the Colorado Plateau with this same eye for discovery, of learning about the landscape, the geology, the topography, the biota, and the human history, recent and ancient. And so I tried to kind of adopt this model that George Fraser so ably demonstrated, of seeing the country with an inquiring mind, really. As I said, there was a really nice friendship that came out of these travels between George Fraser, there on the right, and Dave Rust. Dave labeled this photograph. I should mention that many of his photographs are archived in the Church History Museum in Salt Lake City, and through the good offices of the church archivist and Bill Slaughter, I was able to look through many of these. And Dave Rust had scrawled on this photograph, "Good companions." And he meant not only his friend George Fraser, but also Jerry the mule. So I hope this has been a fun, vicarious sort of journey for you, and maybe it will give you some ideas about how your own travels in the Plateau Province can be made more enriching. And even if you're not spending 600 miles on a pack horse, there's a lot we can learn from this country and a lot of enjoyment to take from it. So thank you very much. Be happy to entertain questions. I'll just flash the credits here for the wonderful archives that enabled the publication of this book. Yeah. You all ready to set out on a trip like this?
Yeah, sure. So, Fred, I'm wondering if Buchanan might be just one more pronunciation for the Buchanan family.
Ah, interesting. That would be fun to find out. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. If anybody has any details on these folks, I'd be very interested to hear.
Sorry. As a someone else from New Jersey who came out here for the geology, I came across your book of the journals of Fraser when I lived in Zion National Park and was just blown away by the places that they went, and just reading about it when it was such an untrammeled place. How did you come across this story? Where did you hear about him? How'd that come?
Well, I had been researching the Dave Rust archives, as I mentioned, up in the Church History Library in Salt Lake City. And he kept mentioning this friend of his, George Fraser. So I was able to locate an article that had been written about him by the historian Stephen Jett. Jett referenced some microfilm copies of his journals that were actually at University of California. And it turned out that Dr. Jett had copied these from the archives in Princeton, where his journals still are stored. So I obtained the microfilm, and with my daughter's help and a big stack of dimes, we went down to the library and copied the pages of 3 of these extensive journals. And so that was the connection there. Good question. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you for a great presentation. I have a couple of questions. In all of the information you gathered about their amazing travels, were there any information about the indigenous people they encountered in their current situation in the early 1900s?
An excellent question, and they really had no encounters with indigenous people in the Utah, in the northern part of their travels. On their traverse of the Navajo reservation, of course, Dave Rust hired a Navajo guide for part of the trip. They stopped in at a few of the trading posts where they met some of the folks who were coming in to trade. It's really kind of a, I don't know, I would say a gap in both in Fraser's journals and perhaps in both he and Dave Rust's understanding of the native peoples. It was kind of an arm's length relationship and not always the most friendly one. I don't know how to explain that except that there was a cultural chasm, I suppose you could say, that was not easily bridged in those days.
Yes, thank you. I'm just curious about that. And when you refer to the church, which church are you referring to?
I'm sorry. Okay. The Rust archives are in the Historical Library of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Have you come across any relationship between the travels of Bernheimer and Rust and Fraser?
I have not. An excellent question. You're referring to, is it George Bernheimer? Yeah, who made extensive expeditions into the Rainbow Bridge country with the guide Zeke Johnson, basing out of Landing generally, I think. Rust and Johnson knew of each other, but I don't know as Bernheimer or Fraser ever met. And very different expeditions. Bernheimer had a huge pack string. It was outfitted with everything imaginable, whereas Rust traveled light. He was kind of an early minimal impact camper with just a couple of pack stocks. So kind of a different fast and light approach, I guess. Yeah. Be good to mention there's a book about the Bernheimer expeditions, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but a very good book that's been recently published. Ask me later if you're interested. Anything? Well, again, thanks so much for coming. It's a great way to close out the year and this venue.
Thanks, Fred. You are a treasure. Yes. I'm Don Gomes, for those of you who know me, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm still Don Gomes. big thank you. Yeah, this is sort of a end of an era tonight. How many of you go back to the 90s with Entrada? Yeah. Phew. But thanks for being here tonight and for your support over the years. It's been pretty special, and it's partly due to a lot of work, but a lot of treasure and pleasure on your part for being here and cheering on programs like this. Do you remember March of 2020? That's when that dreaded COVID hit. Well, Entrada was in the final 2 or 3 months of a 3-year, $50,000 grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, sparking conversation. Some of you probably went to the free dinners for that, right? And we had a great time with that. Well, that changed a whole lot of things. The AmeriCorps crew that was here, along with all of them across the country, were called home. And we didn't know what to do with this grant now. But sometimes, see, there's a saying in fundraising, if you don't ask, you don't get. Well, that was the case here. So at that point, Annette Lamb was president and contacted the National Endowment and said, well, what we'd like to do is get a video camera with the money that's left over so that we can archive. Okay. Well, that mushroomed and changed, and what you see now, John Lee is our tech guru. He has taken on this and is always trying new things. He's here before a program, he's here during it, and for hours afterwards editing it so that we can go on online to see this program again, or performances that were done. So a big thanks to John, please. Now, last night and tonight, we packed this place. That's great. When we begin programs in the Entrada Center, and that's just across the lawn here, we'll have more space, and we continue to have increasing crowds, and that's great. So if you haven't had a chance to see that, give me a call, give me a holler. I'd be glad to give you a tour. It's going to be state-of-the-art everything, acoustics, video, sound, and soft seats. We promise that. So, yeah, we bid farewell to Robert's Roost, and many thanks to Barry Scholl and his family for letting try to use this. It wasn't even $1 a year contract. It's been so great, and we hope that you realize that it's your spirit and your energy that makes it special. Yeah, it's going to be hard to reproduce this funky place, but we'll have all of you involved. And programs, sometimes they fall in our laps. Sometimes you come up with an idea and say, this performer you should get, this speaker, this book. So please don't hesitate to suggest things. They often become really good programs. So again, thank you very much, and I'll leave it to Jed to wrap it up.
All right. Well, thank you, Don. Thank you, Fred, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you all for being here tonight. Just a couple of quick announcements. One, as I mentioned, there are books that Fred has brought for sale, and I should mention at least 2 of his 5 books. This one is Wonders of Sand and Stone. It's a history of Utah's national parks and monuments, published just a couple of years ago by the University of Utah Press. And then, of course, he published a wonderful biography of Dave Rust, A Life in the Canyons, which won at least 2 big awards, the Utah Book Award 2008 and also the Evans Award same year. So I wanted to just make you aware of that. The 2025 Entrada fundraiser is November 15th. And so it's an online auction that begins next week. The online auction begins next week. The fundraiser itself is on the 15th. So watch for that. You can go to the website for more information. Monthly calendars appear in the Insider and on Entrada's website, and for a full calendar is also available on our website, and also by the hat. So if you'd like to be on our email list, please go to the Entrada website and sign up. And of course, please pass by the hat and donate if you feel so inclined. So with that, good night and thank you very much.